Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into a subject that, well, for far too long has kind of remained in the shadows, right?
Yeah.
It's profoundly misunderstood and devastatingly underreported.
That's right.
We're talking about sexual violence against men and LGBTQIA plus individuals.
Yeah.
And our focus today is specifically on these experiences within systems that are, supposedly designed to protect or contain people.
Places like the military prisons.
Exactly. The military prisons and also active conflict zones. We've gathered quite a collection of sources for this, everything from complex legal analyses, survey data, right through to some really powerful personal testimonies.
Yeah, a real range.
Our goal here for this deep dive is to pull out the most critical insights from all this material. We want to challenge some of the common assumptions people hold and really shed light on the systemic barriers and the huge human costs involved.
It's so important.
You should expect to hear some surprising facts, things that might genuinely shift your perspective. And we'll explore together why these experiences are so often, well, silenced.
And what's really striking as we start to get into it is just how pervasive this issue actually is. But how selectively it's been acknowledged, both in society and, legally.
Selectively is a good word for it.
Yeah. Historically, the conversation around sexual violence, which has been absolutely crucial, don't get me wrong, it's led to vital progress, but it is mostly focused on women and girls.
Right, which makes sense in many ways, but
It's inadvertently kind of overshadowed or obscured the experiences of other vulnerable groups. It created this significant blind spot. We're dealing with something with really deep historical roots, going back centuries. If you think about the early legal ideas on this, efforts to prohibit rape in wartime, they actually popped up as early as the 17th century. Hugo Grotius, a foundational jurist, he forcefully argued that the violation of women should not go unpunished in war any more than in peace.
so an early recognition at least.
A very early, though, initially gender-specific recognition. It set a precedent, but a limited one. And despite these, centuries-old assertions and the much stronger frameworks we have in modern international law now.
The problem is still here.
Tragically, yes, it persists. It's often agonizingly unaddressed in certain key contexts, leaving so many survivors without justice, without even acknowledgement. Our sources really force us to confront these historical omissions and the gaps we still have.
We need a broader view.
Exactly. A more inclusive, more nuanced understanding that goes beyond the traditional gender binary. This deep dive, hopefully, will help unravel some of that systemic negligence and the deep-seated societal myths that let this violence thrive.
And you mentioned modern frameworks.
Right. Contemporary international statutes, like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, they actually define rape quite broadly now.
How so?
Well, the definition includes any non-consensual penetration, regardless of the sex or gender of the victim or the perpetrator.
Okay, so the legal tool is there.
It provides a powerful legal framework, potentially, a tool that, if it were used consistently and robustly, it could really broaden the scope of justice for all survivors. But regrettably, it's often underutilized.
So there's a gap between the law on the books and the reality on the ground.
A huge gap. The existence of this inclusive law side by side with the persistent invisibility of male and LGBTQIA plus victims. Well, it presents a stark paradox, doesn't it, one we really need to explore.
That paradox really sets the scene, I think. It points towards something deeply unsettling that we're about to uncover. Our sources, they consistently describe sexual violence against men and LGBTQIA plus individuals as a hidden crisis.
That phrase really captures it.
It does. And it's not just rhetoric. It's this insidious reality where the violence is profoundly difficult to systematically document, to monitor properly.
Which means we probably don't know the true scale.
Exactly. This difficulty, which comes from a whole mess of factors, it inevitably leads to a severe underestimation of its true devastating scope. And this isn't just about numbers or statistics. It represents this pervasive, agonizing chasm of silence.
Chasm of silence, yeah.
Within that chasm, victims, often facing this, like constellation of deep fears and those deeply ingrained societal myths we talked about, they hesitate, or they feel completely unable to report what happened.
The barriers are immense.
Immense. And what's critical for you, the listener, to grasp here are the huge implications of this overlooked status. It directly impacts whether their trauma is even recognized, whether they can access support systems that actually meet their needs, and ultimately whether they can even seek justice.
Recognition, support, justice, all compromised.
Totally. Think about one of the most pervasive myths, the damaging idea that real men don't get raped. or can't be victims of sexual assault.
Yeah.
This idea of masculine invulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Deeply ingrained.
So when a man is sexually assaulted, the experience often feels or is seen as fundamentally incompatible with those traditional rigid ideas of masculinity.
It clashes violently with expectations.
Right. This dissonance, this jarring conflict between cultural expectations and the brutal reality of the assault, it can lead to this profound sense of emasculation. It can strip away their self-perception of strength, of autonomy.
A questioning of their whole identity.
Exactly. An agonizing questioning of their very identity, their sense of self. Sometimes it fragments their identity, you know?
Yeah.
The before self feels totally disconnected from the after self. This intense cognitive dissonance, that discomfort when you hold contradictory beliefs, it creates huge internal conflict.
Compounding the trauma.
Absolutely. Compounds the already immense psychological and emotional trauma. And the societal narrative just makes their experience invisible, deepening their isolation, blocking the path to healing.
Yeah, that cognitive dissonance is just one part of a really entrenched problem. If we link this to the wider picture, the underreporting is just alarmingly rampant everywhere. It really highlights a systemic failure to grasp the true scale.
The numbers you mentioned earlier were shocking.
They are. In the military, sources suggest maybe 86% of all victims never report. That's just staggering in such a structured environment.
86%.
And in prisons, detention centers, it's similarly grim. Only about a third of inmate-on-inmate abuse gets reported, and less than 6%, a tiny fraction of staff sexual misconduct ever comes to light.
Less than 6%. Wow.
This massive silence isn't accidental. It's driven by specific, really formidable barriers that hit male and LGBTQIA+ survivors particularly hard.
Beyond just fear of retaliation.
Well, that fear is very real, obviously. You hear phrases like stitches for snitches in prisons. That's a serious, often life-threatening warning against telling anyone. But beyond that, male victims often face this acute, deeply stigmatizing fear of being labeled or just perceived as homosexual or bisexual after a male-on-male assault.
Even though it was non-consensual?
Completely irrelevant that it was non-consensual. This fear is especially powerful in cultures where homosexuality is taboo or even illegal. It could lead to severe social consequences, ostracism, exile, even legal action against the victim.
That's horrific. You mentioned Syria.
Yeah, it's tragically documented in places like Syria, where there's this disturbing cultural view that the person penetrated is considered homosexual, but the penetrator isn't. It weaponizes that perception against the victim's identity, their social standing.
Unbelievable.
And victims themselves, sadly, might internalize these biases. They start blaming themselves, doubting themselves, believing they should have been able to stop it.
Which feeds into that masculinity myth again.
Precisely. And this awful narrative can get reinforced by involuntary physical responses during the assault, which they or others might mistakenly see as complicity or consent. It just heaps on more guilt and shame.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And another huge barrier is often just language. A lexical void. Men often lack the words to describe their experiences. They're uncertain about whom to approach.
They don't have the framework?
Exactly. There's this widespread confusion and ignorance because men generally are not socialized to have such a framework for understanding male sexual assault, especially if it happens in contexts like hazing, where the motive might be humiliation or dominance, not necessarily sexual arousal in the typical sense.
So they can't even name it as sexual violence.
Sometimes, yes, this lack of vocabulary prevents them from articulating it as sexual violence. They might describe it as torture or humiliation instead, partly to avoid the stigma, but that just perpetuates its invisibility. It keeps the cycle going.
Making healing even harder.
Infinitely harder. The ripple effects are just enormous.
Okay, so we have this profound silence driven by stigma, fear, lack of language. But what about the systems themselves? You mentioned systemic failures.
Right. Beyond the individual trauma, our sources really spotlight these glaring systemic and institutional failures that don't just allow, but sometimes actively enable sexual violence, particularly in these structured places like the military and prisons.
Places you'd expect to be safer, in theory.
Exactly. You'd assume barracks or detention centers would prioritize basic safety, but the evidence shows a really disturbing reality, a kind of pervasive institutional negligence.
Like what specifically?
Well, consider this detail from the sources. Many of the barracks room doors did not have a functioning lock, and security camera systems often had blind spots.
No functioning locks in barracks.
It's shocking, isn't it? This isn't just a minor oversight. It's a fundamental failure to provide the most basic physical security. And it directly contradicts the military's own stated goals of improving prevention and response. There's this huge disconnect.
Between policy and reality.
Completely. The absence of these simple safeguards creates an environment where assaults can happen much more easily, often in these supposedly safe spaces.
And at certain times.
Yes, often when oversight is low or late at night, weekends.
Huh.
This directly facilitates offender tactics, especially targeting victims who are asleep, unconscious, incapacitated. The perpetrator can just gain access without using overt force.
It sounds less like oversight and more like neglect. Systemic neglect.
That's where this concept of institutional betrayal comes in. It's when institutions harm the very individuals who depend on them.
Right.
And finding out that basic safety infrastructure like locks or cameras without blind spots is so neglected, it strongly suggests a systemic problem with priorities, a profound failure by the institutions meant to protect.
Which must destroy trust.
Absolutely. It fundamentally undermines trust in the system. And that, in turn, further discourages reporting. Victims start to feel like the military culture itself or the prison system has actually contributed to their victimization by failing them so badly.
A sense of institutional complicity, almost.
It can certainly feel that way. And if you connect this to the legal frameworks again, the challenges in getting justice are just as daunting, often deeply unfair.
You mentioned Syria's laws earlier.
Yes, in Syria, Article 489 of their penal code only recognizes females as victims of rape. That explicitly creates impunity for assaults against men.
A legal black hole for male victims.
Precisely. A legal lacuna, a gap. And you combine that with practical issues, victims reporting late, lack of cooperation due to fear, complications from alcohol, ambiguous consent situations, not enough corroborating evidence. It makes prosecution incredibly difficult.
Especially if the perpetrators are officials.
Exactly. The sources say perpetrators are often officials or otherwise affiliated with the state's institutions.
Yeah.
This just reinforces the victim's belief that reporting is useless. Why risk it if the system protects the abuser?
It raises questions about bias in international law, too, doesn't it?
It really does. International humanitarian law, IHL, which governs armed conflict. Its treaties mostly use the words sex and women. They often don't clearly distinguish between biological sex and socially constructed gender.
Why is that distinction important?
Because sex-specific needs, like reproductive health, are different from gender-specific needs, which relate more to societal roles, identity, vulnerabilities based on gender perception. This binary approach, which you also see traces of in the Rome Statute despite its broader rape definition, it often fails to treat gender as a spectrum. LGBTQIA+ individuals get overlooked.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Article 27.2 of Geneva Convention the Fifth says women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape. That language about honor has been heavily criticized.
Because it links honor to chastity.
Exactly. It relies on these old gendered assumptions linking women's honor to chastity, potentially reducing women's value to being pure sexual beings, rather than focusing on the violation of their bodily integrity and dignity as a person.
So the language itself can be problematic.
Deeply. These ingrained biases, combined with the fact that independent monitors and aid workers often have very limited access to high-risk detention facilities, especially in places like Syria, it just creates this fertile ground for unchecked abuse, a cycle of violence and impunity.
It's a chilling picture of how systems can fail.
Yeah.
Let's shift focus slightly now to the perpetrators themselves. What drives this?
Okay. Well, the sources are incredibly clear on this. Sexual assault, whether it's in the military, prisons, or conflict zones, is fundamentally about power and control. It's not primarily about sexual gratification.
That's a crucial distinction.
Absolutely crucial for understanding this. It's an expression of violence and power. It's often used very deliberately to unequivocally establish the aggressor's dominance within a social hierarchy.
So it's strategic violence.
Strategic, calculated, it's about domination. And what's striking is how offenders use these subtle but really potent coercive tactics. They exploit vulnerabilities.
Like the use of alcohol.
Exactly. Alcohol plays a pervasive role. One study, looking specifically at male-on-male penetrative assaults in the U.S. Army, found that a huge 67.2% of offenders reported drinking alcohol before the assault.
Wow, over 2/3. How does alcohol factor in?
It seems to act as an excitation factor. It helps offenders overcome inhibitions, things like worrying about consequences or maybe even feelings of fear or moral disgust. It lowers those barriers. And research also shows alcohol increases aggression, especially in people already prone to it.
So it enables the intent rather than causing it.
Precisely. It acts as a disinhibitor for latent aggression or predatory intent.
And does this connect to patterns of repeat offending?
Very much so. The question of serial perpetration is really important here. Sources consistently show that a history of prior investigations for both non-sexual and sexual crimes is a significant characteristic among sexual assault offenders.
They often have a record.
Frequently. In that same Army study, 13.4% of offenders had been investigated for a prior sexual offense. That points to recidivism. But even more starkly, over a quarter, 27.4%, were identified as serial perpetrators with multiple victims.
Multiple victims.
Yes, with one individual linked to as many as 5 known victims. It strongly suggests this isn't just isolated incidents, but a pattern. Most offenders of sexual crimes generally tend to have many victims, as one source puts it.
And it's not just sexual offenses in their past.
No, often it includes a range of non-sexual crimes too: drug possession, domestic violence, theft, pointing to a broader pattern of criminality, a disregard for rules and boundaries.
What about those subtle tactics you mentioned?
Right. One incredibly insidious tactic is using mere presence. Instead of overt physical force, they leverage the inherent power dynamics of the situation or the victim's vulnerability.
How common is that?
In the Army cases of male-on-male assault, it was the primary control tactic in almost 70% of cases, 69.6%.
That's huge. So relying on rank or size or the situation itself.
Exactly. And it's often combined with deliberately incapacitating the victim, like plying them with alcohol, as we discussed, or even surreptitiously drugging their victim.
Making resistance impossible.
Or incredibly difficult. And some offenders use what's called pseudo-courting language.
What's that?
It's a subtle but powerful psychological manipulation. They try to create a false sense of relational intimacy, maybe acting friendly or like they're interested romantically. It's designed to lower the victim's guard, exploit vulnerabilities, and bypass resistance.
Lulling them into a false sense of security.
Precisely. It's deeply calculated. And this approach, combined with the perpetrator's own cognitive distortions where they blame alcohol, like saying, I was drunk and curious, or I don't remember, it allows them to minimize their culpability, avoid responsibility, and just continue the cycle of abuse.
That paints a disturbing picture of the predator. Now, let's look at the other side, the person targeted. Who is most vulnerable?
Well, the sources show that certain individuals are disproportionately targeted. It's often based on perceived or actual vulnerabilities that perpetrators actively look for and exploit.
It's not random.
Definitely not random. It's often quite calculated. For instance, in prisons, where power dynamics are stark, victims tend to be younger, physically smaller. They might have pre-existing mental health issues or disabilities.
And LGBTQ plus individuals.
Unequivocally at much greater risk for victimization in these settings. They face layers of vulnerability. Perpetrators might specifically target those who seem weak and emotionally vulnerable, or who have a known mental illness, viewing it as a sign of weakness they can exploit in that harsh prison hierarchy.
That's incredibly predatory.
It is. And even the sedative effects of some mental health medications can inadvertently make individuals more defenseless during an attack, increasing their risk further.
So multiple vulnerabilities can compound the risk.
Exactly. They often interplay, creating this exponential increase in risk. Like that statistic people with severe psychological distress are 9 times more likely to be sexually abused by another inmate in detention. 9 times.
That's staggering. And what about prior trauma? Does that play a role?
It does, tragically. There's a phenomenon called re-victimization. The sources are clear. Individuals who have been sexually assaulted in the past are at the highest risk for future sexual assault.
Why is that?
It's not fully understood. Maybe perpetrators target characteristics associated with prior trauma, like perceived vulnerability, or perhaps victims' coping mechanisms, like substance use, inadvertently increase their risk again.
Is there data on this?
Yes, a significant number of male victims in the military reported histories of prior sexual or physical abuse, either in childhood or adulthood. Men who experienced adult sexual assault were 5 times more likely to have a history of childhood sexual assault.
A lifelong pattern of vulnerability.
It seems so. And that early trauma appears to amplify trauma-related symptoms like PTSD, anxiety, depression after a later adult assault. It creates this vicious feedback loop of suffering.
It's just layer upon layer of trauma.
It is. And disturbingly, there's also a recognized link going the other way. Individuals who were victims of emotional or physical abuse as children are more likely to perpetrate sexual violence as adults.
Victims becoming perpetrators.
Tragically, yes. Some military offenders in male-on-male cases even use their own history of childhood abuse as an excuse for their crimes, blaming inner demons. It highlights this complex, intergenerational cycle of violence.
Which makes breaking the cycle even harder.
Absolutely. Understanding these layers of vulnerability and the systemic failures that let these cycles continue is just vital.
Okay, so we understand more about who is targeted and why. Let's get specific about where this happens, the environments themselves.
Right. Each setting, military, prison, conflict zones, has its own unique situational dynamics that perpetrators exploit. Understanding these contexts helps clarify how assaults unfold, often hidden in plain sight.
Let's start with the military. You mentioned times and places.
Yes, in the U.S. Army study on male-on-male penetrative assaults, they most often occurred between midnight and 6 a.m. over 60% of cases, particularly on weekends. And frequently in supposedly safe spaces, like the offender's or victim's own barracks room or home.
Betraying that closeness. And alcohol was often involved.
In nearly 40% of cases, alcohol was present where the assault happened. This contributes to the victim being asleep, unconscious, or incapacitated.
The lack of locks and camera blind spots.
Exactly. That late-night, private setting, combined with faulty locks and surveillance gaps, creates this perfect storm for assaults with few or no witnesses. Impunity thrives.
How does that compare to prisons?
It contrasts, but also mirrors in some ways. In male prisons, inmate-on-inmate assaults are most likely between 6 p.m. and midnight. The inmate's own cell is the most common location again, that element of privacy and lack of oversight.
What about staff-on-inmate assaults?
Those tend to happen a bit earlier, between noon and 6 p.m., but the common thread, whether it's inmate or staff perpetrators, is leveraging those profound power imbalances.
How do inmates leverage power?
Well, perpetrators, often gang-affiliated, might target new inmates. They initially act friendly, provide necessities, create a debt, and then brutally leverage that into sexual submission.
It's grooming, essentially.
A form of grooming, yes. And in the most extreme cases, some inmates are forced into sexual slavery. They can be literally sold or rented out, treated as property, even renamed as women, a profoundly dehumanizing act meant to strip away identity.
Symbolic annihilation. That's horrific. And in conflict zones, is it different again?
In conflict, it often tucks on a different dimension. Conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, is frequently used as a deliberate, strategic weapon of war. It's not just about individual gratification, it's a calculated tool.
A weapon? How?
As psychological warfare, a means of control, a way to destroy identity and community cohesion. Both state forces, like intelligence branches in Syria and non-state armed groups, are documented perpetrators.
Targeting specific groups.
Yes, it can be explicitly targeted against ethnic, racial, or religious groups to symbolically dominate them, or used specifically to emasculate or homosexualize male victims, reducing their social status. This happens often in detention facilities, the place of highest risk for men and boys in conflict, or at checkpoints during house raids.
And it's not just rape.
No, the forms are extensive. Forced nudity, specific genital violence, forcing people to witness sexual violence against others, all designed to inflict maximum psychological harm and act as a form of state terrorism, spreading fear throughout the population to ensure control.
The scale and intent are just terrifying. What about the aftermath for survivors, the consequences?
The consequences are devastating and multifaceted, extending far beyond the immediate assault, especially for male and LGBTQIA+ victims.
What stands out in the sources?
Consistently, across all settings, military, prisons, conflict, suicidal thoughts and attempts are highlighted as among the most severe and pervasive psychological and emotional consequences.
It's that common.
It's consistently observed and deeply intertwined with the abuse, a direct, agonizing response to the trauma for many.
And physically.
Significant physical consequences, too. STIs, including HIV, are a major risk, particularly in prisons and conflict zones. The risk is often higher because of the nature of the assault's penetrative acts, causing genital and rectal trauma and pain, fistulas, and fissures.
Which increases infection risk.
Dramatically. And this is compounded by failures in providing adequate, timely medical care to these survivors. It's another layer of systemic neglect.
You mentioned earlier the psychological impact on masculinity. Can we unpack that more?
Yes, it's a core part of the trauma for many male victims. They frequently internalize that belief we discussed. They should have been able to stop it. This leads to intense self-doubt, powerlessness, self-blame.
Reinforced by society and perpetrators.
Exactly. It connects directly to that perceived loss of masculinity, the feeling of feminization. Societal and military expectations paint men as assertive, powerful, never victims, creating this incredibly painful dissonance.
And perpetrators exploit this.
Sometimes explicitly, telling male victims things like, "You're no longer a man, you are going to become one of our women." It's a deliberate attempt to strip away their identity, causing severe psychological distress, deep stigma, and discouraging reporting even more.
Which brings us back to that code of silence.
Absolutely. It's fiercely enforced, especially in prisons. Inmate hierarchies punish disclosure severely. Stitches for snitches isn't just a phrase. Victims also fear being branded with demeaning labels punk, sissy, turnout, which effectively strips them of their manhood in that environment and marks them as fair game for more abuse.
So the shame and fear are overwhelming.
Profound shame, combined with the fear that authorities won't believe them or that they'll face social ostracism, it creates this almost impenetrable barrier. Silence becomes preferable to reporting, even when someone is experiencing severe psychological distress, even suicidal thoughts.
The isolation must be unbearable.
It's profoundly isolating. They're trapped with the trauma, often unable to access any help.
Given this incredibly bleak picture of harm, silence, and systemic failure, how do we even begin to create change? What do the sources suggest?
Well, the sources present a clear, urgent call for holistic reforms, legal, policy support systems. It has to be multifaceted. No single fix will work.
Where's the starting point?
The most vital first step, emphasized repeatedly, is repealing or amending discriminatory laws.
Like the Syrian law you mentioned.
Exactly. Laws like Article 489 in Syria, which only recognize female victims, must be changed to protect men and boys too. Gender inclusivity in the law is fundamental.
What else legally?
Decriminalizing homosexuality is crucial in many contexts. Laws criminalizing unnatural sexual intercourse effectively punish victims while letting perpetrators act with impunity, sometimes even using the law against the victim.
So these legal changes aren't just symbolic.
Not at all. They're foundational. They directly challenge those deep cultural assumptions about male invulnerability we talked about.
How so?
By repealing discriminatory laws, you actively help dispel myths. By explicitly protecting LGBTQIA+ individuals, the legal framework itself starts to shift societal perceptions, fostering a more inclusive understanding of who can be a victim.
What about practical things, like reporting to doctors?
Right. Removing mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals like they have in Syria is also recommended. Those laws actually deter survivors from seeking medical help because they fear an automatic police investigation and the consequences.
And international law. Is the Rome Statute definition enough?
The definition itself, covering any penetration regardless of gender, is robust. The problem is implementation. Especially in places like Syria, the political will for accountability is often missing. Law without justice.
And the biases within IHL.
Those historical gender biases in international humanitarian law, linking protection to outdated notions like honor, need to be addressed. And ensuring independent monitors get unfettered access to detention centers is critical for accountability.
Especially if the violence seems systematic.
Exactly. If it looks like a state policy of torture, as it does in some detention facilities, then legal reform and sustained international pressure become even more urgent.
Legal reform is huge, but it takes time. What about support systems for survivors now? How do we rebuild trust?
That's the other critical piece. Rebuilding trust and enhancing support systems. This is about creating a reality where survivors, especially men and LGBTQIA+ individuals, feel safe enough to come forward and get help.
What's needed there?
A key call is for dedicated and inclusive funding specifically for male survivor programs.
Dedicated funding.
Yes, meaning additional funding. It shouldn't take away from the vital resources for women and girls initiatives, but rather expand the overall capacity to address sexual violence comprehensively. This is important because there's been a historical lack of attention to male survivors in training and service design.
Services have been geared towards women.
Often, yes. They're organized around the experiences of women and girls, which can leave male survivors feeling like the services aren't for them, further marginalizing them.
So services need to be more inclusive.
Inclusive, but also tailored. The sources emphasize universal and tailored provision. Humanitarian and government strategies need to offer appropriate medical and MHPSS support, that's mental health and psychosocial support, for all refugees, regardless of official registration status, no one left behind.
MHPSS, okay.
And services need to be gender-inclusive, gender-specific where needed, and age-appropriate. This might mean specific male-targeted services or dedicated safe spaces and shelters for men and LGBTQIA+ survivors.
What about practical access? How do people reach out, especially from prison?
Confidential hotlines and correspondence are lifelines. Letters to organizations like Just Detention International, JDI, they receive thousands weekly. These are crucial for incarcerated survivors.
And in the military, is there anything similar?
The military has the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Program, SAPR. They have SARCs, Sexual Assault Response Coordinators, and victim advocates. They offer 2 reporting options.
What are they?
Restricted reporting is anonymous. It lets victims access counseling and medical help without triggering an investigation or notifying command. Unrestricted reporting initiates a criminal investigation.
So having that choice might encourage reporting.
That's the idea, to reduce the fear of repercussions. And advocates play a critical role everywhere. Under PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, incarcerated survivors must be offered a certified rape crisis advocate during medical exams.
What do advocates do?
They inform survivors of their rights, ensure their wishes are respected, protect confidentiality. They're crucial. However, that fear of disclosure, the lack of guaranteed confidentiality, especially within military DoD systems, is still a huge barrier for male victims.
Trust is still fragile.
Very. Which underlines the need for consistent, trauma-informed care from qualified, interdisciplinary teams who have clinical independence. That includes prompt medical care, STI HIV testing, and crucially, post-exposure prophylaxis, PEP, for HIV.
PPP, the medication after exposure.
Exactly. It's a course of HIV meds taken soon after exposure to prevent infection. These vital medical steps are often overlooked for male survivors. It's a critical gap in care.
So we need legal reform, better support systems. What about the culture itself? How do you change the environments where this happens?
That's the third crucial pillar. Shifting the culture. Policies aren't enough. We need a profound cultural shift, driven by specialized training, public awareness, and unwavering accountability.
A zero-tolerance culture.
Precisely. Especially in prisons. Moving away from that awful idea that prisoner rape is just an inevitable consequence of being locked up. It means fundamentally reshaping mindsets in the military and prisons to genuinely prioritize accountability and human rights.
Does training actually help?
The evidence suggests it does. Well-trained staff are directly linked to lower rates of sexual abuse. Training matters.
What kind of training?
Specialized training for correctional staff, detention personnel, military service providers. It needs to include factual info about male sexual assault and directly tackle those common myths. Staff need to be equipped to identify, understand, and respond sensitively to male survivors and challenge their own biases.
Especially given the power imbalance.
Absolutely. Training is vital because, remember, staff members commit the majority of sexual abuse in custody. They have total control. Effective training hammers home that staff hold the power and are responsible for setting professional boundaries. It's about preventing the abuse of that power.
And beyond staff, what about wider society?
Public information campaigns are critical. They need to sensitize communities, reduce stigma, debunk myths like men can't be raped, and encourage all survivors to disclose using culturally appropriate gender-inclusive language.
How do you make that effective?
By explicitly using examples of male survivors in educational materials, by sharing real stories respectfully. That helps validate experiences and encourage reporting.
And research, data collection.
Essential. We need robust data collection and research methods to safely gather and anonymously share data on the patterns of violence against men and boys. We need methods that account for the unique barriers to disclosure and the miscategorization that often happens.
So we know it's working.
Exactly. So prevention and response efforts can be continuously evaluated and improved based on evidence. It's this comprehensive approach tackling infrastructure, culture, training, data, support that's needed to really dismantle the structures that allow this violence.
That brings us toward the end of this really important deep dive. We've covered so much ground. The painful realities, the systemic negligence, the myths, the silence surrounding sexual violence against men and LGBTQIA+ individuals.
Yeah, the lack of locks, the legal gap.
Exactly. We looked at perpetrator tactics, victim vulnerabilities, the devastating aftermath, but also, crucially, the path forward. the need for legal reform, better support, and that deep cultural shift. It's been a lot to process.
It really has. And it leaves us with a pretty critical question for you, the listener, to think about, doesn't it?
Which is?
Well, if the very systems meant to protect the military, prisons, even humanitarian structures, can also be places of profound vulnerability and betrayal, what does that really tell us about our broader societal responsibility?
Responsibility to do what?
To acknowledge, prevent, and respond to sexual violence in all its forms, for everyone. How do we collectively ensure that happens? Because true justice, real healing for all survivors, it depends on more than just policy changes.
It needs a shift in us.
I think so. A collective shift in empathy and understanding, and a real commitment to creating genuinely safe spaces for absolutely everyone.
That's a powerful thought to end on. So what stands out most to you from this deep dive? We really hope you'll take these insights with you. Maybe think about how you can be part of this vital conversation, advocating, supporting, or just challenging myths when you hear them.
Every little bit helps chip away at the silence.
Absolutely. Until our next deep dive, keep learning, keep questioning, and let's all keep striving for a more informed and just world.